Melania Trump insulted Jasmine Crockett on live TV, but Jasmine Crockett's stunning response left her speechless and the audience in complete shock. It all began in a space that was never supposed to ignite. It was billed as a conversation, not a clash. A primetime special, framed with soft lighting and neutral backdrops, meant to feel more like a fireside chat than a political panel. The title was Forgettable Voices in Politics. Bridging the Divide, the kind of name that signals civility before the cameras even roll. The audience was a curated crowd of donors, students, and media figures. The moderator, a seasoned anchor known for making senators cry without raising her voice, welcomed viewers with the kind of polished charm that promised balance over buzz. But the room was already tight with something else. When Jasmine Crockett walked out first, there was a sharpness to her stride, not aggression, just clarity. She wore a navy blue blazer, sharp at the shoulders, with her hair twisted into a low bun that didn't move even when she sat. The applause was polite, maybe even a little cautious. Then came Melania Trump. The reaction changed. Melania was dressed in cream, smooth lines from neck to heel, her signature expression unreadable, like she was already halfway done with the conversation. She gave a small wave, took her seat, and crossed her legs slowly. Not a smile, not a word. The audience leaned forward. No one had expected the pairing. Jasmine, the unapologetic congresswoman from Texas known for unfiltered clarity, sitting across from the former First Lady whose silence had always been louder than her statements. Two women from opposite ends of the map, politically, stylistically, narratively. The segment started gently. Policy questions, measured tones. Jasmine spoke with focus, Melania with practiced pauses. They disagreed, but it was all camera safe. No one interrupted. No one raised their voice. It almost looked like the show was going to play out as intended, smooth, watchable, forgettable. But tension has a way of creeping in when everyone's pretending it isn't there. Melania's eyes didn't flinch when Jasmine talked about community violence and broken funding systems. Jasmine didn't blink when Melania mentioned the importance of grace under pressure. It wasn't cold, not yet, but it was cooling. And then, 15 minutes in, the moderator shifted the topic to tone. Political discourse. Public decorum. Do you think women in politics are judged more harshly for how they speak? That was the moment. Not the explosion, but the inhale before it. Melania Trump didn't raise her voice. She didn't roll her eyes. She didn't even look at Jasmine when she said it. She just adjusted the cuff of her sleeve, placed her hands neatly in her lap, and spoke in the same soft cadence she'd used since the East Wing. Some women, she said, use anger as a brand, but elegance is stronger. The sentence fell gently, almost too gently, like a feather floating down with a brick tied to the end. The audience didn't gasp, not right away, but something shifted. You could hear it in the way the room stopped breathing for half a second too long, in the way the moderator's lips parted, like she was about to say something but hadn't decided what, and in the way Jasmine Crockett didn't move, not a blink, not a twitch, just stillness, the kind you learn when you've been baited before and know exactly what not to give away. Melania didn't clarify. She didn't have to. The subtext had been signed, sealed, and delivered with that one line. It wasn't just a comment on tone. It was a judgment, dressed in couture. Elegance is stronger. It sounded like a compliment to no one in particular, but everyone knew where it was aimed. The cameras didn't cut. The moderator tried to smooth it over with a follow-up about women being multidimensional in leadership. But the energy in the room had already changed. Because that wasn't a policy disagreement. That was a character swipe. And Jasmine knew it. She didn't interrupt. She didn't force a smile or nod politely. She just reached for her water, took a slow sip, and set the glass down with a kind of precision that made even the background band stop shuffling their sheet music. A few heads in the audience turned, quietly checking each other. Did she just say that? She did. It wasn't the kind of moment that explodes. It was the kind that simmers. The kind that gets clipped, replayed, and dissected before the credits even roll. And Melania just sat there, back straight, lips pursed. Elegant. But Jasmine? Jasmine was still quiet. Which, somehow, was louder. There are silences that settle gently. This wasn't one of them. This silence arrived like a slow storm, not with thunder, but with the kind of weight you feel in your chest before the lightning hits. Jasmine didn't flinch, didn't adjust her posture, didn't even blink as Melania's words echoed in the studio's perfect acoustics. Some women use anger as a brand, but elegance is stronger. No name, no finger pointed. But the aim was precise. The audience looked to Jasmine like they were waiting for a spark, maybe even hoping for one. A clapback, a cutting quip, something worthy of the clip already being cut by someone in the control room. But she gave them something else. Stillness. A pause so full, it emptied the rest of the room. Jasmine didn't grab the mic. She didn't shift in her chair. She let the moment hang, let it steep. The moderator, visibly tight-lipped, prepared for a pivot. She leaned forward slightly, half an inhale from redirecting the tension. But Jasmine moved first. Not suddenly, slowly, deliberately. She leaned in. Not for the camera, but for the clarity. She looked not at Melania, but past her, through her, as if speaking not to the person, but to the idea that had just been laid at her feet like a challenge dressed in silk gloves. And then she began. Not with a rebuttal, not even with a defense, but with a question that landed like a stone dropped into a still pond. Why is it, she said quietly, that when black women speak with strength, it's called anger, but when others condescend with a smile, it's called grace? She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Because the volume was in the precision. The moderator froze. The audience held their breath. Jasmine didn't stop. She kept her tone steady, the kind of steady that people mistake for softness until they realize it's made of steel. Everyone had expected the same old debate script. Point, counterpoint, polished closing lines. Instead, Jasmine was writing something new, and the room wasn't ready for what came next. Jasmine's voice didn't waver. It didn't climb, it didn't harden, it just pressed forward, low and certain, like it knew exactly how far it needed to go and refused to stop short. I've heard that word used my entire life, she said, looking now at the moderator, not Melania. Elegance. A single word, but it carried weight, not the kind worn on a runway, the kind stitched into expectations, the kind used to decide who was palatable and who was not. Elegance, she repeated, has been used as a weapon more than once, not to uplift, but to erase. There it was. The line that didn't sound like a punch, but hit like one anyway. Elegance doesn't mean erasure. The room shifted. Some crossed their arms, some uncrossed their legs. A few leaned forward without realizing they had. Because that sentence didn't just respond to Melania's jab, it reframed the entire conversation, took the lens off tone, and put it squarely on who gets to define it. Where I come from, Jasmine continued, we didn't get taught how to be elegant. We were taught how to survive, how to speak clearly even when nobody's listening, how to stand straight even when the ground's shaking. Her words didn't come dressed in metaphor or academic polish. They came like testimony. And somewhere in the audience, a woman in the second row nodded slowly. Like Jasmine wasn't just answering a comment, she was answering a lifetime of coded expectations. Melania stayed still, expression neutral. Her brand was control. And Jasmine? Hers was precision. And that precision kept cutting. When elegance is used to quiet us, she said, to shame us for passion, to shrink us into palatable silhouettes of who we are, then it's not elegance anymore. It's just another way to say, sit down quietly. And I didn't come here for that. No yelling, no shade, no spectacle. Just truth, said slowly enough for everyone to hear it, even if they didn't want to. The moderator blinked. Once, twice. And for the first time all night, Melania looked unsure. Jasmine didn't press. She didn't have to. She'd already shifted the air in the room, and no one was breathing quite the same. The thing about rules is, they're rarely written for everyone. They're whispered, inherited, applied unevenly depending on who's in the room and who's doing the talking. Jasmine Crockett knew this. Knew it because she'd lived it, argued against it, stood in rooms designed to mute her, and managed to turn her volume up anyway without ever raising her voice. So when the moderator, trying to regain neutral ground, asked, how can we create space for different communication styles in politics? Jasmine didn't wait. She leaned in, elbows on the desk now. Intentional, not aggressive. Just present in a way that refused to be minimized. We keep pretending the rules are universal, she said, but they're not. Her tone was still low even. She wasn't rattled. She was cutting through velvet with a scalpel. When I speak with passion, you call it anger, she continued. When I raise my voice to be heard over a room that's already talking over me, you call it unprofessional. When you whisper your point, it's called class. When I say mine clearly, it's called a problem. There it was. Not a retort. A reckoning. The room went dead quiet. Not a single cough. Not a single shuffle. Just the weight of a truth that had been hanging unspoken between sound bites for years and now finally had a microphone. Melania didn't move. But her smile, the one that had been frozen on her face since Jasmine first responded, tightened at the corners, just enough to betray tension behind the polish. Jasmine didn't press. She didn't perform. She spoke like someone who had stopped explaining herself long ago, but knew this time everyone needed to hear it anyway. "You don't get to label our conviction as chaos," she said. "You don't get to call us emotional for caring, or difficult for daring to speak without asking permission." It wasn't applause-line delivery. She didn't chase reactions. But the audience? They weren't sure what to do with themselves. Because what she said didn't need punctuation. It needed silence to settle in. And that's exactly what it got. No one told the audience to pull out their phones. But when the air shifts like that, when a truth walks into the room and doesn't flinch, someone always hits record. It started with a single phone, held low in the second row, screen glowing softly in the dim studio light. Then another, a few seats back. Then a third, not for clout, not even for virality. Just instinct. The sense that this wasn't part of the regularly scheduled programming. A producer in the control room leaned into her headset. "This wasn't in the run sheet," she whispered. It wasn't panic in her voice. It was awe. On stage, Melania adjusted her posture, recrossed her legs, tilted her head like she was about to interject. She smiled, finally wide, measured, practiced. The kind of smile that's meant to smooth over an awkward exchange. But it didn't land. It hovered. Because everyone knew what it was meant to do. Redirect. Soften. Reassert control. And it came too late. The moment had already slipped through the cracks and onto the internet. The moderator, ever the professional, tried to steer the conversation gently forward, something about bipartisanship, civility in discourse, working together across divides. The usual patchwork. But the energy on set wasn't the same. Because something had broken open. You could see it in the way audience members didn't look at the stage the same way anymore. In how they glanced at their phones, rewatching what had just happened while still sitting in the room it happened in. No one yelled, no one walked off set. But something had shifted. Melania's expression flickered for half a second, something between annoyance and confusion before settling back into blankness. She wasn't used to being challenged like this. Not directly, and definitely not calmly. Because that was the problem. Jasmine didn't fight back. She didn't escalate. She didn't bite. She clarified. And that made it impossible to reframe her as irrational. The silence wasn't a lull anymore. It was evidence. And the internet? It had just hit record. If people were waiting for a clapback, they didn't get one. Not the kind they expected. No snark, no zinger, no mic drop designed for the algorithm. Instead, Jasmine Crockett did something far more dangerous. She dismantled. Carefully, calmly, with precision that didn't cut to wound, but to expose. And what she exposed wasn't just a comment. It was a system, a pattern, a way of being silenced that's dressed up like etiquette. Melania Trump sat back, legs crossed, expression unreadable. But Jasmine didn't even look her way. She looked into the crowd. Into the lens. Into the space where young women watching from dorm rooms, nail salons, kitchen counters, were leaning closer, holding their breath. "Where I come from," Jasmine said, her voice soft but solid, "we weren't taught to be silent to be seen. We were taught that if you didn't speak up, someone else would speak over you and write the story without your name in it." You could feel the breath leave the room in waves. Because this wasn't about decorum anymore. This was about definition. About who gets to speak and still be respected. About who gets to take up space without being told to shrink. Melania shifted slightly in her chair. The moderator cleared her throat, but didn't interrupt. Because everyone knew this wasn't the part where you step in. This was the part where you listen. "My tone," Jasmine said, "isn't the problem, it's the excuse." She didn't quote stats. She didn't raise her voice. She told the truth with the kind of calm that makes people nervous because it leaves no cracks to escape through. "I've been called emotional when I was exhausted, angry when I was clear, hostile when I was right, but I kept showing up, and I'm still here." No punchline. No applause break. Just impact. Measured, heavy, true. And for a second, even the cameras seemed to slow down, as if trying to catch every frame of what it looks like when someone reclaims a narrative not with fire, but with focus. Jasmine didn't clap back. She clarified. And that was louder than anything else. Before the cameras, before the debates, Before the headlines and the hashtags and the pinned tweets, there was a little girl in South Dallas with too many questions and not enough people willing to answer them. Jasmine Crockett wasn't born with a microphone in her hand. She earned it. Brick by brick. Word by word. In a neighborhood where sidewalks cracked like tired voices and buses groaned late into the night, Jasmine learned how to be heard before she learned how to drive. Her mother, Marlene, didn't have the time or luxury for long lectures. She led by example, quiet strength, steel-wrapped tenderness, and eyes that said, "Don't flinch," louder than any warning ever could. Marlene cleaned houses for people who didn't remember her name, then came home and asked Jasmine about her school day like her voice mattered more than fatigue. There was never enough money, but there was always time for truth. Jasmine learned early that being smart didn't always feel safe, that some teachers praised you if you spoke softly and punished you if you spoke clearly. That raising your hand too often came with side eyes, not gold stars. At 8, she was told she talked back. At 9, she learned the word articulate wasn't always a compliment. At 10, a teacher called her a little dramatic for questioning why certain neighborhoods had more police and fewer parks. But Jasmine didn't shrink. She asked anyway. At home, she'd sit on the floor while her uncle fixed busted radios and cracked jokes about politicians. She listened more than she spoke, but when she did speak, people looked up. She didn't yell. She didn't plead. She named things. By high school, debate team was less an activity and more a necessity. Her outlet, her armor, her language sharpened into a tool no one could ignore. Her arguments weren't loud. They were layered. Built from lived experience. Framed by fire. South Dallas didn't give her grace. It gave her grit. And that's why, years later, when a former First Lady tried to redefine her with a sentence wrapped in subtlety, Jasmine didn't react like someone caught off guard. She responded like someone who'd been here before, just in smaller rooms, with less light. The truth? She'd been preparing for this moment her whole life. Back in the studio, the temperature hadn't risen, but the room felt hotter, not from lights or nerves, from the truth hanging in the air like thick smoke. Jasmine Crockett had just laid bare a lifetime of being mislabeled, reduced, repackaged. Not with volume, not with venom, but with the kind of clarity that makes people sit up straighter without knowing why. Melania Trump didn't respond right away. Her smile was still there, technically, but it had changed. Gone was the polished poise, the resting elegance that had carried her through charity galas and Christmas press junkets. What was left now was thinner, tighter around the eyes, fixed like someone trying to hold on to a script they hadn't rehearsed for this version of the show. She shifted slightly, straightened her posture, and tried to brush the moment away like lint on silk. "I meant no offense," she said, voice flat, brows barely lifting. "I believe in strong women, always." The words fell like a damp paper napkin there, but unable to wipe anything clean. Jasmine didn't break eye contact. She didn't even blink. She just nodded once and replied, with a kind of softness that still landed like a weight. "Intent doesn't erase impact," she said, "especially when the impact is generational." The audience let out the smallest sound, not a gasp, not applause, just a collective breath people didn't realize they'd been holding. Melania shifted again. It was the kind of sentence that couldn't be argued without looking defensive, couldn't be dismissed without sounding hollow. Jasmine hadn't accused her. She hadn't even addressed her by name. But the mirror had been held up, and what showed in the reflection was discomfort dressed in couture. The moderator tried to step in. "Let's pivot to," she began. But the moment had taken root. Jasmine wasn't gloating. She wasn't pushing. She had simply refused to let the conversation get dressed up in politeness and passed off as progress. And now, no one could pretend they hadn't heard what had been said or what had finally been answered. By the time the moderator tried to pivot something about education policy or bipartisan hope, it was already too late. The panel had stopped being a discussion and become a reckoning. The energy had shifted. It wasn't chaotic. It was quieter than that. More dangerous, because it left everyone suddenly aware of how exposed they were. The other guests, a senator from Ohio and a think tank rep with too many acronyms behind his name, both fell completely silent. Not out of politeness, but self-preservation. They sat with the stillness of people who knew a wave had just come through and weren't sure whether to swim or stay still. Melania's smile had faded altogether now. Her lips pressed into a thin line, her hands folded tighter in her lap. The elegance she invoked just 15 minutes earlier now felt brittle, less like strength, more like armor that didn't quite fit. The moderator gave it one more try. "Well, let's return to the question of..." She didn't finish the sentence. The control room was already blinking. One producer leaned toward another, hand cupping the mic. We should cut to break. But we're only cut. Because even they knew this wasn't going to smooth out. The show had been designed to ease tensions, to model conversation between ideological opposites with polished edges. But Jasmine Crockett hadn't come to play the part. She came to name the thing no one wanted to admit had been in the room the whole time. And once it had been said, intent doesn't erase impact, the illusion snapped. The floor director flashed the signal. Red light blinked. The music cue rolled a half-second too slow. The broadcast dipped to commercial. But not before the cameras still hot caught Melania adjusting her earpiece, whispering something to someone off camera, her face flushed. And Jasmine sitting calm, steady, eyes forward, like the only person in the room who hadn't forgotten how real this was supposed to be. It wasn't fireworks. It was a fault line cracking just enough for light to get in. And someone, maybe several someones, had caught it all. The clip hit Twitter 17 minutes after the commercial break. Shot from a shaky angle in the third row, the video opened just before the tension snapped. Melania's voice, smooth but cool. Some women use anger as a brand. The camera caught Jasmine's face, still and unreadable. Then the moment her leaning in, the words landing like a velvet hammer. Intent doesn't erase impact, especially when the impact is generational. The caption? Simple. Jasmine Crockett just educated a former First Lady in real time. It took less than 10 minutes for it to go viral. Views doubled every 5 minutes. Likes poured in like a faucet someone forgot to turn off. A blue-check journalist reposted it with, "This is what clarity looks like. No shouting. Just facts and fire." A TikTok version appeared before the hour was out, complete with subtitles and a gospel choir instrumental humming in the background. People weren't just watching it, they were studying it. Replays, slow-mos, word-for-word transcriptions, side-by-side edits comparing tone, posture, expressions. Social media had turned the segment into a syllabus. Jasmine Crockett. Intent vs impact. Elegance or erasure. It wasn't the first time a political moment had gone viral. But this one was different. It wasn't built for clips. It wasn't rehearsed for reaction. It was quiet, grounded, unapologetically measured. And that's why it hit so hard. On Instagram, Black women flooded the comments with thank yous. She said what we've been feeling. She didn't flinch, and she didn't need to. We don't always need to shout to shift the room. By midnight, the clip had 3.2 million views. And the momentum was still building. Because something about the way Jasmine held her space calmly, clearly, without turning the moment into a spectacle, forced people to rethink what power actually looks like when it shows up unshaken. This wasn't a rant, it was a revelation. And the internet, for once, wasn't just reacting. It was listening. By morning, the takes were already flying hot, cold, and everything in between. Supporters called Jasmine a masterclass in composure. Cable anchors used words like poised and unflinching. One editor at a major news outlet tweeted, "You just watched the rules of political dialogue get rewritten by someone who didn't raise her voice once." But not everyone saw it that way. Critics wasted no time reframing it. She was too confrontational. She made it personal. She ambushed Melania on live TV. The same lines. The same coded language. A familiar script being pulled from the same dusty drawer. One pundit on a right-wing panel called it a manufactured moment of victimhood. Another accused Jasmine of hijacking the conversation for clout. But here's what was different this time. The counter-narratives weren't sticking. Because Jasmine hadn't rolled her eyes. She hadn't snapped or shouted or walked off set. She had stayed still, stayed sharp, spoke her truth with surgical calm. And the footage didn't lie. People could see the difference. Even viewers who didn't follow politics were chiming in. "I'm not into government stuff," one comment read. "But I know what it looks like when someone finally says enough without turning ugly." Educators started sharing the video in classrooms. Speech coaches pointed to it as an example of controlled authority. A women's leadership organization posted, "This is what it looks like when you don't match disrespect with chaos, you match it with clarity." But maybe the most important reactions weren't from the loudest voices, they were from the quiet ones. A single post from a retired librarian. She didn't just stand up for herself. She stood up for the rest of us, too. For once, the backlash didn't bury the moment. It only confirmed it. Because Jasmine Crockett hadn't asked for the spotlight, she had answered it. And now that the light was on her, it was revealing more than anyone expected. By the next morning, Jasmine's inbox had turned into a living archive. Not of congratulations, but of recognition. The messages didn't come from political strategists or headline chasers. They came from fourth-grade teachers, nonprofit organizers, paralegals, librarians, nurses. Women who'd never run for office, but knew what it meant to stand in a room where their voice was too much until it was needed. The subject lines were short. Thank you. That was for us. I've been waiting to hear that for years. And inside? Stories. Confessions. A kind of collective exhale. You said what my boss said to me last week, one woman wrote. But you said it without cussing, without crying, just clear, like it deserved to be said out loud. Another. That wasn't a clapback. That was a recalibration. You took the whole table and shifted the legs. There were mothers who said they'd watched it with their daughters, pausing every few sentences to explain the subtext they had spent years learning to decode. A black law student from Georgia wrote, I study how to be professional enough to be respected and still feel like I'm performing. You showed me that I'm not crazy for feeling that way. One note came from an older woman in Baton Rouge. When you said we weren't taught to be silent to be seen, I had to stop the video and sit with it, because that was my mother, and me, and now my granddaughter too, until last night. Jasmine read as many as she could. Not all at once, it was too much to hold in a single sitting. But she kept returning to them, letting them sink in, not as praise, but as confirmation. This wasn't about going viral. It wasn't even about Melania anymore. It was about resonance. And now that people had heard it, really heard it, they were answering back. Not with applause. With memory. And gratitude. Because Jasmine hadn't just spoken for herself. She had made space. And people were walking into it, full voice. The official statement came late. Tucked between press briefings and a weekend fundraiser announcement, it landed like a carefully worded sigh. Mrs. Trump believes in respectful discourse and regrets that her comments have been misinterpreted. She remains committed to empowering women of all backgrounds. No apology, no ownership, just a soft press of the rewind button without admitting the tape had ever played. But the internet had already moved past the statement. Because the footage was everywhere, replayed, recut, captioned, reanalyzed. And people weren't just reacting to the moment anymore, they were dissecting the meaning behind it. The word that kept resurfacing? Elegance. A word that sounded harmless until you realized how often it had been used to gatekeep, to silence, to sanitize a conversation before it could say anything real. Threads started popping up long, deeply sourced explainers on the history of coded language in public spaces. Think pieces titled, The Weaponization of Elegance. Elegance versus expression. Who gets to be heard? When poise becomes a muzzle, people broke it down like it was a courtroom exhibit. Who gets praised for staying calm? Who gets punished for raising their voice? Who gets to be graceful, and who gets told to behave? And the answer wasn't buried in theory, it was right there, in the way Jasmine's steady voice was framed as threatening by critics, while Melania's cool detachment was treated as diplomatic. Some tried to defend Melania. She didn't mean it that way. She's not confrontational. She was just being classy. But the tide didn't move. Because intent couldn't cover what had already been uncovered, a script that too many women had lived, even if they'd never seen it play out on a panel before. This time, the damage control didn't stick. Because it didn't feel like control. It felt like a deflection, and people had already seen what it was trying to erase. Jasmine hadn't demanded an apology. She demanded acknowledgement. And the world had responded not with forgiveness, but with understanding. By Sunday morning, it wasn't just trending, it was transforming. The moment between Jasmine Crockett and Melania Trump had already racked up millions of views, but something deeper was happening now. It had cracked open a conversation bigger than either of them. Think pieces started to drop, sharp and fast. Elegance as control. The politics of politeness, who gets to be loud. Tone policing in real time. Writers didn't just analyze the clip, they unpacked it. They dissected the nuance, the timing, the history sitting quietly behind Jasmine's steady delivery. Historians weighed in. A professor from Spelman wrote, "This is how black women have navigated white spaces for generations, not by raising their voice, but by carrying a truth heavy enough to speak for itself." Cultural critics joined the chorus. She didn't clap back, one essay read. She corrected the narrative with surgical grace and made sure the scalpel left no bruises, only clarity. Artists posted visual tributes, stills of Jasmine mid-sentence, turned into line drawings, digital collages, with the quote, "Elegance doesn't mean erasure. Spoken word poets sampled the audio into pieces about ancestral silence and inherited restraint. The clip was being played in college classrooms, church pulpits, open mics. It had entered the bloodstream of the culture, and not as a flash in the pan. As a signal, this wasn't just about tone. It was about permission. Who gets to speak plainly without being painted as a threat? Who gets to define what dignity looks like? And why had that definition been tied to quietness, softness, and often whiteness? It wasn't a panel anymore. It was a pivot. And Jasmine hadn't asked for a movement. She had just refused to shrink for someone else's comfort. And that refusal lit a match that had clearly been waiting to burn. She didn't do the circuit. No interviews, no back-to-back panels, no morning after victory lap with mugs and makeup chairs. Jasmine Crockett made one post. Black background, white text. No filter, no tag. I don't raise my voice to be heard, I raise the truth. That was it. No caption, no hashtags, no need. Because by then, the moment had already spoken for her. Loud enough to echo, quiet enough to cut. Journalists reached out. Dozens, maybe hundreds. She turned them down. I'm not interested in re-explaining what I already made clear, she told her team. Let the moment breathe. And it did. That silence, the one she had started with on stage, and returned to now became its own kind of power. People expected her to expand. Instead, she held the line. That choice didn't shrink the moment. It amplified it. Because we live in a world addicted to overexposure, to hot takes, fast spins, immediate reactions. And Jasmine offered something rare: restraint. She didn't need to win the news cycle. She had already shifted the narrative. Across the country, people took her one sentence and made it their own. Teachers printed it out and pinned it above whiteboards. Community organizers quoted it at rallies. Someone spray-painted it on a boarded-up storefront in Atlanta. I don't raise my voice to be heard, I raise the truth. The sentence didn't ask for applause. It demanded reflection, and that's what stuck. Because Jasmine Crockett hadn't just responded to an insult, she had redefined the space around it. And then, with discipline most couldn't muster, she stepped back and let the echo carry what it needed to. Unrushed, unshaken, unapologetically clear. By midweek, it was no longer just a trending clip, it was curriculum. In classrooms across the country, the moment between Jasmine Crockett and Melania Trump was being paused, replayed, and unpacked not as gossip, but as case study. At Booker T. Washington High School in Atlanta, a civics teacher dimmed the lights and played the clip for her 10th grade class. The whiteboard behind her read, "Coded language in public discourse. Who defines tone?" She didn't explain much. She didn't have to. The students leaned in the moment Jasmine began speaking. They didn't laugh. They didn't talk over it. They watched. Closely. After the clip ended, the teacher asked, "What just happened here?" One girl, braided hair tied up high, raised her hand slowly. She didn't clap back, she said. She set the record straight. Heads nodded across the room. Another student asked, "Why did it feel like Melania was the one yelling, even though she never raised her voice?" That question lingered. In Detroit, a university panel on media ethics pivoted mid-session to dissect the moment. A professor brought up the phrase, "Intent doesn't erase impact." The room buzzed with commentary, not all of it in agreement, but none of it indifferent. Even at a private high school in Connecticut, students debated whether elegance had ever truly been neutral. A young Latina student said, "I used to think I had to soften everything to be heard, but maybe it's not my job to whisper so people feel comfortable." Educators started using the clip to talk about rhetorical power. Speech coaches rewrote lesson plans. And slowly, the class debate around poise, professionalism, and passion began to change shape. Because for so long, class had been taught as a volume setting, not a value. But Jasmine hadn't yelled. She hadn't cracked. And yet she held the room, the feed, the country. And now, students were seeing themselves not in the rebuttal, but in the restraint. Because what Jasmine had modeled wasn't just a reaction. It was a recalibration of power. Not every reaction went viral. Some didn't even make it out of the room. In board meetings, church groups, book clubs, and lunch breaks, quiet conversations began. Behind closed doors, conservative women, many of whom had never said Jasmine's name aloud, started asking each other hard questions. Why did that moment stick with me? Why did her calm feel more powerful than confrontation? Have I ever used the word angry when I meant uncomfortable? These weren't Twitter threads. They were whispered reckonings. At a donor dinner in Charleston, one woman leaned across the table and said, I didn't agree with her politics. Still don't. But what she said? That wasn't about politics. That was about truth. In San Antonio, a mentorship circle for young black girls spent an entire evening just talking about Jasmine's face when she paused and how much power was packed into not flinching. In Philadelphia, a group of Muslim high school students had a roundtable discussion on cultural respectability and public perception. I've been told to watch my tone since I was 12, one girl said. Jasmine didn't watch hers, she owned it. And in a quiet corner of a kitchen in Tulsa, a grandmother showed her teenage granddaughter the clip and said, "This is what I mean when I say speak your mind without losing yourself." Jasmine didn't hear these conversations. She wasn't tagged in the posts, she wasn't looped into the DMs, but her voice was there echoing quietly in rooms she might never enter. Because she hadn't spoken for attention. She had spoken with intention. And now, that intention was expanding, taking root. Not in the loudest rooms, but in the overlooked ones. In side eyes turned into second thoughts. In young women no longer over-explaining themselves in meetings. In the pause before calling someone angry, just because they dared to speak clearly. Jasmine wasn't in those rooms, but her presence was. And it didn't need to be loud. It just needed to last. The sentence didn't come with fanfare. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't rehearsed. It just dropped clean, undeniable into a moment that didn't know it was about to change shape. Elegance doesn't mean erasure. And then, without permission or promotion, the phrase took on a life of its own. It showed up first on Twitter headers, then on t-shirts sold by black-owned bookstores. Teachers wrote it in cursive above whiteboards. Artists sketched it onto poster prints, framing Jasmine Crockett's silhouette beside it like a modern-day proverb. College students painted it across dorm hallway walls. One small cafe in Houston put it on a tip jar. It wasn't a slogan. It was a signal. That you could be composed and still commanding. That being soft-spoken didn't mean being silenced. That you didn't have to be palatable to be powerful. At a subway station in Brooklyn, a woman stood wearing a canvas tote that bore the line in bold letters. A stranger pointed and whispered, "I saw that live." The woman just nodded. In New Jersey, a handwritten letter arrived at Jasmine's office from a 74-year-old grandmother. "I watched it with my granddaughter," she wrote. "And I just kept thinking you didn't raise your voice, but you raised the room. You stood with your back straight. That's elegance to me." The letter was signed in looping cursive. "Respectfully, someone who remembers when silence was the only option." That sentence, just 6 words, had reached places Jasmine never intended, but exactly where they needed to go. Into barbershops and beauty salons, staff rooms, living rooms, sanctuary halls. It had been spoken quietly, but it had echoed clearly. And what started as a reply to a veiled insult had become something larger. A permission slip. A mirror. A new definition of dignity. One that didn't ask for approval. It simply arrived. And stayed. Months passed. The headlines faded. The think pieces slowed. The internet, as always, moved on. But the moment, it didn't. Because some things don't live on a loop. They live in the quiet shifts they cause and the ones they carry forward. Jasmine Crockett didn't chase the next viral moment. She kept showing up in hearings, town halls, policy briefings. Steady. Still unfiltered. Still unshaken. One autumn afternoon, she stood in a community center on the south side of Fort Worth. Folding chairs, fluorescent lights, no cameras. Just people. She was mid-sentence about local policy when a girl, maybe 11, maybe 12, raised her hand. Big eyes. Braided hair. Hoodie too big for her. "When you said that stuff on TV," she began, "were you scared?" The room quieted. Jasmine paused, just like she had that night on set. Then she smiled. Small but certain. "No," she said, "I wasn't scared. A beat. I was ready. That was it. No applause. Just understanding." Because the girl didn't ask if it was brave. She asked if it was scary. And Jasmine had answered the deeper thing. That readiness isn't always loud. Sometimes it looks like stillness. Like choosing not to shrink. Like knowing you belong before the room agrees. Afterward, the girl stayed behind. They didn't take a selfie. They didn't post it. They just talked. Later that night, Jasmine wrote the moment down in a notebook she didn't show many people. Just a line. Readiness is louder than rage. Because that's what this had been from the start. Not a revenge arc. Not a mic drop. A reminder. That poise doesn't mean silence. And power doesn't have to shout. Sometimes it just sits up straight, says the thing, and lets the world catch up. This story was intense, but this story on the right-hand side is even more insane.